before we descend into the depths of Hallownest to unravel the tragic tale of its fallen monarch, make sure to like and subscribe, because we're about to explore how one being's desperate attempt to save his kingdom became the very thing that doomed it. The Pale King stands as one of gaming's most fascinating and morally complex characters, a god whose brilliance was matched only by his capacity for devastating choices. And tonight we're going to examine every fragment of his story, every hidden detail, every tragic decision that led to the fall of an entire civilization. To understand the Pale King, we must first understand what he was before he became a king at all, because his story doesn't begin with a crown, but with light piercing through an age of darkness and instinct. In the time before Hallownest, before the grand spires and the White Palace, before the kingdom that would become a grave, there existed only the eternal dream of the Radiance, an ancient light that bound all bugs in a hive mind of shared consciousness, where individual thought didn't exist and creatures lived purely by instinct. The bugs of this era weren't truly alive in the way we understand life. They were extensions of the Radiance's will, moths who worshipped her light, and mindless insects who acted without thought or purpose beyond survival. Into this world came something new, a worm, an ancient being of tremendous power who existed in a form vastly different from what we know as the Pale King. Worms were massive serpentine creatures, higher beings of immense age and unknowable origin, entities that existed on a scale beyond mortal comprehension. This particular worm looked upon the bugs trapped in their dreaming existence and saw potential for something more, saw the possibility of sapience, of civilization, of greatness that could never flourish while the Radiance kept all minds locked in her dream. What happened next was an act of transformation so profound that it reshaped reality itself, because the worm didn't simply die, but instead underwent a metamorphosis, shedding its massive form and being reborn as something smaller, more refined, more capable of walking among the bugs he sought to elevate. In the depths of the ancient basin, in the place that would become known as the birthplace, the worm cast off its old shell and emerged as the Pale King, a being of smaller stature but no less power, now capable of kingdom building rather than mere existence. The discarded shell of the worm remained in the basin as a monument to what was sacrificed, a massive serpentine corpse that stretched through caverns, a physical reminder that the Pale King had given up godhood of one form to achieve something he believed more important. With his transformation complete, the pale being began to spread his influence across the land that would become Hallownest, and his power was unlike anything these bugs had ever known, because where the Radiance offered unity through shared dreaming, the Pale King offered something far more precious and dangerous. He offered sapience itself. His pale light didn't bind minds together, but instead freed them, granting individual consciousness, the ability to think and choose and build and create, giving bugs their own minds for the first time in existence. This was the king's gift and his power, the ability to bestow true sentience, to take creatures of pure instinct and elevate them to thinking beings capable of language, art, architecture, and civilization. As his influence spread, bugs began to abandon the Radiance's dream, drawn to this new pale light that promised individuality over unity, consciousness over instinct, and the ancient moth tribe who had worshipped the Radiance for eons turned away from their old god to serve this new one. The Radiance was forgotten, her moths sealed away the knowledge of her existence, and the bugs who had once been extensions of her dreaming became citizens of Hallownest, a kingdom founded on enlightenment and the pale light of their new king. The Pale King established his palace in the ancient basin, later moving to the Grand White Palace that would become synonymous with his rule, and around him he built a civilization of unprecedented sophistication, with the City of Tears as its jewel, a metropolis of Gothic architecture and rain-soaked streets where bugs of all kinds lived as individuals rather than drones. Hallownest grew to encompass vast territories, from the fungal wastes to the howling cliffs, from Greenpath's verdant tunnels to Deepnest's twisted depths, and everywhere the king's influence reached, bugs gained minds and purpose. He took a worm's mate, a being known as the White Lady, a root creature of immense age and power, who became his queen and partner in the grand project of civilization building. Together they ruled from the White Palace, a structure of pale ore and impossible geometry that seemed to defy the laws of physics, with rooms that folded into themselves and architecture that suggested the king's mastery extended beyond mere rulership into the fundamental nature of space and reality. The Pale King was not merely a monarch, but a researcher, a scholar, a being obsessed with understanding the nature of soul and void and the fundamental forces that governed existence. His workshop within the White Palace contained experiments and machinery designed to probe the deepest mysteries of their world, because the king's intellect was as much his defining trait as his pale light, and he sought to understand everything, to master every principle, to achieve perfection through knowledge and application. The kingdom prospered under his rule. Bugs who had never known individual thought now created art and poetry. They formed families and friendships. They built structures and created culture. And all of this was possible because of the pale light that had freed their minds from the radiance's ancient dream. But forgetting a god doesn't destroy them, and the radiance, ancient and furious at being abandoned by those who had worshipped her, began to dream of revenge from whatever sealed place the moths had trapped her. The infection began subtly, as these things always do, with a few bugs reporting dreams of light, of a calling they couldn't quite explain, a pull towards something ancient and bright that promised unity and an end to the burden of individual consciousness. The Pale King, with his vast intelligence and his researchers and his instruments, recognized what was happening, understood that the forgotten light was returning, that the radiance was reaching out through dreams to reclaim the minds that had been taken from her. What started as isolated cases spread like a plague, because the infection wasn't a disease of the body, but of the mind, a reversion to that ancient hive mind existence. And infected bugs began to lose their sapience, their individual thoughts dissolving as the radiance's dream reasserted control over them. The orange glow appeared in their eyes, that telltale sign of the infection taking hold, and infected bugs became aggressive, violent, attacking anyone not yet claimed by the dream. The Pale King watched his kingdom begin to crumble, saw the civilization he had built, and the minds he had freed being consumed by an ancient light he had believed forgotten. And he knew he had to act. His solution was born from desperation and genius in equal measure, because the Pale King theorized that the infection spread through dreams, through the dream realm that all bugs touched when they slept. And if he could create a vessel, a being without dreams, without mind or will or voice, a pure empty container, then that vessel could be used to contain the radiance herself. The plan was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He would seal the radiance inside a being incapable of dreams, effectively creating a prison from which the ancient light could never escape, ending the infection forever by trapping its source within a living void. But creating such a vessel wasn't simple, because bugs naturally possessed minds, and even the smallest spark of consciousness would compromise the seal, allowing the radiance to exert influence and eventually break free. The Pale King needed something that existed outside normal creation, something born from the void itself, that dark force that existed in opposition to all light and life and thought. In the depths of the ancient basin, at the very bottom of the abyss, there existed the void, a liquid darkness that seemed to absorb all light and purpose, a fundamental force of emptiness that predated even the worms and the radiance. The king conducted his experiments at the edge of this abyss, and what he did there remains one of the most controversial and tragic aspects of his entire reign. because he and the White Lady created children, countless children, and then cast them into the abyss to be transformed by the void. These vessels, as they came to be called, were born of the Pale King and the White Lady, but reshaped by void, turned into living containers of emptiness, beings without voice or mind or will, or at least that was the intention. The eggs were allowed to hatch in the abyss, and the newborn vessels were left to climb the sheer walls in darkness, struggling upward toward the light of the workshop above, and most fell back into the void and died there in the depths. The Pale King watched this procession of his own children, attempting to reach him, and he tested each one that succeeded in climbing from the abyss, searching for the perfect vessel, one that showed absolutely no hint of consciousness or will or thought. Thousands died in the abyss. Thousands more were rejected as imperfect, showing some small sign of mind or emotion or attachment that would compromise their ability to contain the radiance. And the Pale King discarded them all, literally throwing them back into the void because anything less than perfection would doom the entire kingdom. Eventually, one vessel emerged that seemed to meet his requirements, one that showed no reaction to any stimulus, that stood in perfect stillness and silence, that appeared to be exactly what the king needed, a pure empty shell ready to serve as the radiance's prison. This vessel the king named the Hollow Knight, and he raised it in the White Palace, trained it in combat, and prepared it for the task that would define Hallownest's fate. The Hollow Knight was honoured and recognised throughout the kingdom, depicted in statues and monuments, known to the citizens as their salvation, the pure vessel that would contain the infection and preserve their way of life forever. But the Pale King made a mistake, a critical error born from his desperation, and perhaps from the one weakness in his otherwise brilliant mind, because the Hollow Knight was not actually hollow at all. At some point during its raising, during the time it spent in the White Palace being trained and prepared, the Hollow Knight developed something it should never have possessed, an idea instilled, a bond formed, feelings of loyalty, or perhaps even love, toward the Pale King, who it saw as a father figure. This tiny imperfection, this microscopic crack in the vessel's emptiness, would eventually doom everything the king had worked for, but he didn't recognize it, or perhaps he couldn't afford to recognize it, because there was no time to begin the process again, no time to create and test new vessels while the infection continued to spread. The sealing of the radiance was a kingdom-wide event, a ritual of tremendous power that required not just the Hollow Knight, but also 3 dreamers, bugs who would sacrifice their own lives to become living seals reinforcing the vessel's prison. The dreamers were Hera the Beast, Queen of the Weavers of Deepness, who agreed to the king's request in exchange for a child of her own, Lurien the Watcher, who served the king with absolute loyalty from his perch overlooking the City of Tears, and Monomon the Teacher, brilliant researcher who ran the archives and sought knowledge with the same fervour as the king himself. These 3 would enter eternal sleep, their consciousness bound to totems that reinforced the seal on the Hollow Knight, and they could never be woken unless all 3 died simultaneously, ensuring the radiance would remain trapped, even if the vessel began to fail. The ritual was performed in the Temple of the Black Egg, a structure created specifically for this purpose, sealed by chains of binding and protected by ancient magic, and inside the Hollow Knight was imprisoned along with the radiance it contained. The temple doors sealed shut, the dreamers fell into their eternal sleep, and for a time it seemed the Pale King's plan had worked. Because the infection receded, infected bugs recovered their minds, and Hallownest began to heal from the plague that had nearly destroyed it. The Pale King had saved his kingdom through sacrifice and terrible choices, had ended the infection through means that required him to discard thousands of his own children and imprison one in eternal torment. But it had worked, or so it seemed. Yet the king must have known, or suspected the truth, must have understood on some level, that his perfect vessel was flawed, because rather than celebrating his victory, he seemed to retreat, becoming more isolated, more focused on his research, as if preparing for an outcome he desperately hoped would never come. The White Lady withdrew to the Queen's gardens, sealing herself away in bonds of root and branch, unable to bear what they had done, or perhaps preparing for the infection's inevitable return. The Pale King's activities in the final days of his life remain mysterious. He continued his experiments, worked on machinery and constructs whose purposes weren't fully understood, and seemed to be desperately searching for alternative solutions or contingency plans. In the workshop beneath the White Palace, he created the King's Moulds and Wings Moulds, elegant void constructs that served as guards, demonstrating his continued work with void, even after the Hollow Knight's sealing. He placed arcane seals throughout his palace, protections and mechanisms that suggested he was fortifying against something, though whether external threat or internal collapse remains unclear. The Kingdom's Edge, the Colosseum of Fools, the various territories of Hallownest all continued functioning, but reports suggest the king became increasingly withdrawn, less present in the daily governance of his realm. Then came the day when the Hollow Knight's imperfection began to manifest, when the tiny spark of will within the vessel allowed the radiance to begin pushing back against her prison, and the infection returned to Hallownest with a vengeance. This time, there was no stopping it, no time to prepare a new solution, because the dreamers remained asleep and the Hollow Knight remained sealed, but the seal was failing, and infected bugs began appearing throughout the kingdom once more. The Pale King faced the reality of his failure, his greatest achievement undone by the smallest imperfection, his kingdom dying because he had been unable or unwilling to recognize that the Hollow Knight possessed the one thing that would doom them all, a mind shaped by the bonds formed during its upbringing. What happened to the Pale King in the end is not explicitly shown, but his fate is clear from the evidence scattered throughout Hallownest, because at some point the Pale King died, his body left sitting on his throne in the White Palace, crown still upon his head, dead from causes never fully explained. Some speculate he performed a ritual that cost him his life. Others believe he simply faded as his kingdom collapsed around him, unable to bear the weight of his failure. But regardless of cause, the god who had elevated an entire civilization from dreaming instinct to conscious thought was gone. The White Palace itself was hidden away in the dream realm, accessible only through a special awakening, as if the king wanted to preserve or hide the place even in death, keeping its secrets and his workshop away from whatever came after. His death marked the effective end of Hallownest as a functioning kingdom, because without the Pale King's presence and with the infection spreading unchecked, the civilization he had built began its slow collapse into ruin. The 5 great knights who had served him scattered or fell. The King's Mould Guard stood eternal vigil over an empty palace. The citizens of Hallownest either died to the infection or tried to flee, and the City of Tears became a tomb of rain and silence. Understanding the Pale King requires grappling with the fundamental contradiction at his core, because he was simultaneously Hallownest's greatest hero and its architect of doom, the being who freed bugs from mindless existence, and the father who threw thousands of children into the abyss. His gift of sapience was genuine and profound, transforming creatures of pure instinct into thinking beings capable of art, love, family, and civilization. Yet this same gift made them vulnerable to the Radiance's infection in a way they never would have been as mindless drones. The Pale King genuinely loved his kingdom. That much is clear from his desperate attempts to save it, from the lengths he went to in seeking a solution to the infection. Yet he was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of that salvation, including countless children and the one vessel he sealed away in eternal torment. His brilliance is undeniable. His understanding of soul and void and the fundamental forces of reality exceeded perhaps every other being in Hallownest's history. His architectural achievements, like the White Palace, demonstrated mastery over space itself. Yet this same brilliance led him to believe he could create a being truly, without mind, could achieve the impossible perfection his plan required. The Pale King embodied the concept of the enlightened tyrant, the ruler who genuinely wants the best for his subjects and possesses the intelligence to achieve great things, but who operates from a position of such elevated perspective that the costs of his decisions, measured in individual lives and suffering, become abstracted into acceptable losses. He made choices no one else could make, bore burdens no one else could bear, and ultimately failed despite, or perhaps because of his willingness, to sacrifice everything for the greater good. The tragedy of the Pale King is that his plan was nearly perfect, came within a hair's breadth of working forever, failed only because of the smallest flaw, an idea instilled in a being that should have been pure emptiness. If the Hollow Knight had truly been hollow, if the king had recognized the imperfection, or had time to try again, if any number of small things had gone differently, Hallownest might have endured forever as a shining example of civilization and consciousness. Instead, his legacy became ruins and regret, a dead kingdom filled with infected husks and the ghosts of bugs who had briefly known what it meant to think and feel before having that gift torn away by the returning dream. The White Lady's reflections on her former king are telling, because she acknowledges both his brilliance and his flaws, recognizes that he was blinded by his need for perfection, unable to see imperfection in something he desperately needed to be flawless. In the Queen's gardens, bound in roots and hidden away, she waits in a kingdom that no longer exists, holding memories of what they built together and what they did to try to preserve it, and her guilt is palpable because she participated in the creation of the vessels, laid the eggs that became thousands of discarded children. The Hollow Knight itself stands as the ultimate evidence of the king's failure, locked in the temple of the black egg, infected essence leaking from its shell as it struggles to maintain the seal against a god pushing to break free from within. The dreamers sleep their eternal sleep, unaware that the seal they died to reinforce is failing, that the Hollow Knight suffers in its prison, that the king who asked this sacrifice of them is long dead, and his kingdom has fallen to the very plague they were supposed to prevent. Throughout Hallownest ruins remain scattered with evidence of the Pale King's presence and influence, from the statues bearing his image, to the White Palace's impossible architecture, to the workshop containing his experimental machinery. And every piece tells a story of breathtaking ambition and tragic failure. The path of pain, a hidden gauntlet of saw blades and spikes within the White Palace, suggests the king's philosophy of achievement through suffering, of proving worth through endurance of impossibility, and at its end sits a single memory showing the Hollow Knight standing beside the king in what might have been a moment of connection, the very bond that would doom his plan. The Collector, a void being that imprisons grubs throughout Hallownest, operated under the king's direction or influence, demonstrating his willingness to use even void creatures in service of his goals, though the Collector's ultimate purpose remains ambiguous. Arcane eggs scattered throughout the kingdom, each worth tremendous amounts of geo, represent some aspect of the king's research or perhaps attempts to create alternative solutions, precious artifacts whose true purpose died with their creator. The vessels of Godhome reveal additional context about how the Pale King was perceived, because in that realm of gods and worship, the king appears among the pantheons, recognized as a higher being worthy of reverence, despite or perhaps because of his controversial choices. His fight in Godhome shows his abilities at full power, wielding both physical weapons and soul-based attacks, demonstrating why he was feared and respected, capable of combat that matched the kingdom's greatest warriors despite his small stature. The dialogue from various NPCs who remember the Old Kingdom reveals a range of perspectives on the Pale King, from reverent worship to bitter condemnation, because not everyone in Hallownest agreed that his gifts were worth their costs. Bugs who gained consciousness through his influence might understandably be grateful for minds they otherwise never would have possessed, while others might blame him for the infection that destroyed those same minds, and both perspectives contain truth. The mushrooms of the fungal wastes notably remained outside the king's influence, maintaining their own form of collective consciousness, neither truly individual nor part of the Radiance's dream, suggesting alternatives existed to the binary choice between hive mind instinct and vulnerable sapience. Deep within the lore, we find suggestions that the Pale King understood more about the nature of their world than he revealed, that his research into soul and void and dreams uncovered truths about the fundamental structure of reality, that his experiments were pushing at boundaries most bugs couldn't even perceive existed. The lighthouse in the Howling Cliffs, the grim troop's knowledge of the king, the connections between various higher beings and ancient powers, all hint at a broader context in which the Pale King was just one player in cycles and struggles far older than Hallownest itself. The void itself represents one of the great mysteries the king sought to understand and harness, a force of absolute emptiness that opposed both light and life, that existed as absence rather than presence, and his decision to use void as the solution to the radiance shows either incredible insight or desperate hubris. Creating life from void, shaping emptiness into beings with form and function, goes against the fundamental nature of both concepts, and perhaps this philosophical impossibility is what doomed the Hollow Knight, because void shaped into a living vessel inherently contradicts itself, cannot maintain perfect emptiness when forced into the role of container and guardian. The Pale King's relationship with his knights, his scholars, his servants, all reflect different facets of his character, because he clearly inspired tremendous loyalty, bugs willing to die for him and his kingdom, willing to accept eternal duties or make ultimate sacrifices because they believed in what he had built. The great knights each had their own reasons for serving, from the training-focused dedication of the five to Ogrim's simple, loyal devotion, but all recognized in the king something worth following, a vision of civilization and order worth protecting. Quirrell's master Monomon chose to become a dreamer, despite understanding it meant eternal sleep and eventual death, believing the king's plan represented the only hope for Hallownest's survival, trusting his intellect even when the cost was her own existence. The Soul Master, twisted by his experiments, was attempting to follow in the king's footsteps, seeking to harness soul as a solution to the infection, but lacking the king's wisdom or restraint, he became something monstrous, demonstrating the danger of attempting to replicate the king's work without his full understanding. Throughout the City of Tears and beyond, we find evidence of the culture the king enabled, bug societies that developed art and architecture, families that formed and raised children in safety, commerce and learning, and all the aspects of civilization that only became possible once bugs possessed individual minds capable of participating in these complex social structures. The resting grounds, where bugs could finally have peaceful deaths and proper burials, stands as evidence of the king's more compassionate influences, because he brought not just consciousness, but dignity to his subjects' entire life cycles. The eternal emissary, the ancient civilization that preceded Hallownest, the suggestion that the kingdom was built atop older ruins, all indicate that the Pale King wasn't creating something entirely new, but rather building his civilization on the bones of what came before, perhaps learning from past failures, or claiming ancient knowledge for his own purposes. The king's understanding that the ceiling would eventually fail becomes clearer the deeper we examine the evidence, because his continued research, his creation of additional void constructs, his apparent retreat into increasingly desperate experiments, all suggest he knew the Hollow Knight was imperfect and sought alternatives even after it was too late to change the primary plan. His greatest achievement was creating sapient civilization from dreaming instinct. His greatest failure was believing he could maintain that civilization through methods that required inhuman perfection. And his greatest tragedy was that he was almost right, came closer to achieving the impossible than any being had right to expect. The Pale King's story raises profound questions about the costs of civilization, about what sacrifices are acceptable when the alternative is extinction or eternal unconsciousness, about whether gift and curse can be separated when consciousness itself brings both beauty and suffering. Would the bugs of Hallownest have been better off remaining as mindless extensions of the Radiance's will, safe from the infection because they had no individual minds to corrupt, living forever in instinctual unity without art or love or choice, but also without knowledge of what they lacked? Or does the brief flowering of conscious civilization, the few generations where bugs lived as thinking individuals, justify the terrible cost that preservation required, validate the king's choices, even though they ultimately failed? The answer depends on perspective and values, on whether we measure meaning in duration or intensity, on whether potential matters more than outcome, and the game wisely refuses to provide a definitive moral judgment, instead presenting the evidence and allowing players to reach their own conclusions. Some see the Pale King as a hero who made impossible choices to save his people, who bore the burden of decisions no one else could make, who achieved something miraculous and beautiful, even if it couldn't last forever. Others see him as a tyrant whose arrogance led him to believe he could play with the fundamental forces of existence without consequence, whose inability to accept imperfection or defeat led him to discard thousands of children in pursuit of impossible standards. Both readings are supported by the text, both contain truth, because the Pale King was complex enough to embody both noble intention and monstrous execution, brilliant insight and blind arrogance, genuine love for his kingdom, and willingness to sacrifice anything to preserve it. His death on his throne, crown still worn, palace hidden in dreams, suggests a being who remained committed to his role even as everything collapsed, who died as he lived, a king to the very end, even with no kingdom left to rule. The fact that his body remained on the throne rather than being properly entombed or ceremonially handled suggests his death was unexpected, or that no one remained who could properly interview a dead god, that the White Palace's withdrawal into the dream realm happened at or shortly after his death, preserving him in state forever. Modern Hallownest, the ruins the player explores, is post-Pale King, a kingdom slowly dying as the infection spreads unchecked, and the seal on the Hollow Knight continues to fail. And everywhere we go, we see evidence of what was built and what was lost. The citizens who remain are husks of infected bugs, their individual minds consumed by the Radiance's returning dream, or survivors hiding in corners, like Elderbug in Dirtmouth or Quirrell on his journey. Bugs trying to understand what happened to their world. The Pale King's legacy is this ruin, these empty streets and infected husks, this slowly dying dream of civilization. Yet also the brief time when bugs knew consciousness, when art was created and families formed, when the kingdom of Hallownest stood as proof that transformation from instinct to sapience was possible. His gift cannot be taken back even by his failure, because the bugs who remain conscious, who resist the infection's pull, possess minds they would never have had without his intervention, carry memories of a better time that existed only because he made it possible. Understanding whether this trade was worth it requires understanding what consciousness means, what value we place on individual thought versus collective unity, what price is acceptable for the gift of self-awareness, and these are questions that extend far beyond Hallownest into the nature of existence itself. The Pale King forced this question into reality, transformed an entire population, and then failed to protect that transformation, left bugs trapped between two states, unable to return to mindless unity under the Radiance, but also unable to maintain the individual consciousness he granted. The knight, the player character, is themselves a rejected vessel, one of the thousands thrown back into the abyss. Yet they climbed out. They survived. They returned to Hallownest with the power to actually complete what the Pale King started. The knight succeeds where the Hollow Knight failed precisely because they were rejected, because they developed their own will and mind away from the king's influence, became something neither purely hollow nor bound by loyalty, and in multiple endings they become the seal that actually works, or they destroy the radiance entirely, achieving what the king never could. This irony cuts deep because the Pale King's obsession with perfection, his rejection of any vessel showing the slightest imperfection, led him to discard the one being who could have actually saved everything. To choose a flawed vessel he believed perfect over a perfect vessel he believed flawed. The knight's strength comes from being abandoned, from developing capability through struggle, from existing outside the king's carefully controlled plans, and they succeed specifically because they are not what the king wanted them to be. In this way, the Pale King's legacy is completed by his failure. His kingdom saved not through his brilliant planning, but through the accidental competence of a discarded child. And whether this redemption redeems his choices or condemns them depends on how much weight we give to intention versus outcome. If we judge him by results, the Pale King failed catastrophically, his kingdom fell, his plan collapsed, and countless beings suffered because of choices he made. Yet if we judge him by the near impossibility of his task and how close he came to succeeding, perhaps his achievement deserves recognition even in failure. The game presents us with a dead god on a throne in a hidden palace, his kingdom in ruins, his perfect plan revealed as fundamentally flawed, yet also with the evidence of what he built, the minds he freed, the civilization that briefly flourished under his pale light. Players exploring Hallownest encounter this legacy in every statue and architectural wonder, in every NPC who speaks with individual voice and thought, in the very fact that the kingdom existed at all as something more than mindless drones serving an ancient light. The White Lady's final assessment of her former partner acknowledges his brilliance and his blindness, his achievements and his crimes, and she accepts her own role in what they did together, the choices made in desperate hope of salvation. The Godmaster content adds another layer by showing how the king was perceived in the realm of gods and worship, treated as a being worthy of battle and recognition, his power and importance acknowledged even in a place that exists outside normal reality. His presence in the pantheon suggests that whatever his moral failings, his impact was profound enough to earn him a place among the gods, that beings who existed on levels beyond normal comprehension recognized him as significant. The philosophical questions raised by the Pale King's story resonate because they mirror real concerns about progress and costs, about whether advancement justifies sacrifice, about who gets to make decisions that affect entire populations. And the game handles these themes with surprising depth for a Metroidvania about bugs. His character works as tragedy specifically because we can understand his motivations, can see how each choice followed logically from his perspective, can recognize that someone else in his position might have made identical choices. Yet we also see the devastating consequences and wonder if alternative paths existed. Could the Pale King have negotiated with the Radiance rather than attempting to seal her? Could he have found a way to allow bugs both individual consciousness and connection to her dream? Could he have accepted imperfection in the Hollow Knight and worked around it rather than assuming completeness? Could he have been more honest with his kingdom about the costs and risks, rather than hiding the abyss's horror from all but a few? These questions haunt the ruins of Hallownest because they represent missed opportunities, theoretical, better outcomes that remain forever unknowable, and the king died without answers. His final days apparently spent in increasingly desperate research seeking solutions that never came. The machinery in his workshop, the seals placed throughout the palace, the creation of additional void constructs, all point to a being who refused to accept defeat, even as evidence of his failure mounted, who kept working until the very end in hope of finding some alternative, some way to save what he had built. His dedication is admirable, even as his methods are questionable, his love for his kingdom genuine, even as his willingness to sacrifice anything for its survival remains disturbing, and this complexity makes him far more interesting than a simple villain or hero. The Pale King represents the dangers of pursuing impossible perfection, of believing that sufficient intelligence and dedication can overcome any obstacle, of assuming that the ends justify absolutely any means. Yet he also represents the necessity of leadership making difficult choices, of someone willing to act when inaction means certain doom, of sacrifice in pursuit of something greater than individual comfort. Hallownest exists because he was willing to transform himself from worm to king, to undertake the work of building civilization, to grant consciousness to bugs who otherwise would have dreamed forever under the radiance. And that achievement cannot be entirely dismissed, even knowing what came after. The bugs who lived conscious lives in Hallownest, who raised families and created art and experienced love and joy and individual purpose, had those experiences only because the Pale King made them possible. And from their perspective, the gift of consciousness might have been worth any cost, even the infection that eventually claimed it. Yet the bugs who died in the abyss never had the chance to make that choice. The Hollow Knights sealed in eternal torment never agreed to its fate, and the citizens infected and reduced to husks certainly didn't consent to becoming collateral damage in a god's failed experiment. So the moral balance remains impossible to definitively calculate. The Pale King story asks us to consider these contradictions without offering easy resolution, to sit with the discomfort of a character who embodies both profound good and profound harm, to recognize that historical impact rarely falls neatly into categories of right and wrong. His throne sits empty now, his crown rests on his corpse, his palace hides in dreams, and his kingdom falls apart in slow motion, but the evidence of what he attempted remains carved into every stone of Hallownest. The knight who returns, who succeeds where their creator failed, carries forward the possibility of redemption, but also the weight of abandonment, the knowledge that they survived only because they were deemed inadequate, that their strength comes from rejection rather than selection. In defeating or containing the radiance, in potentially breaking the cycle of infection and sealing, the knight completes the Pale King's work, but not his vision, because they succeed through methods he never anticipated, through being imperfect rather than hollow, through forming connections and gaining power that pure emptiness could never achieve. This suggests that the king's fundamental assumption was wrong, that the solution required not perfect hollowness, but controlled imperfection, not absence of will, but directed will, not an empty vessel, but a filled one capable of choosing its purpose. The irony is devastating because it means all the children cast into the abyss, all the suffering inflicted in pursuit of impossible purity, all the careful planning and terrible sacrifice was based on a flawed premise that the king's brilliance led him to the wrong solution, executed with tragic precision. If he had recognized that imperfection properly directed could work where hollowness would fail, if he had trained vessels to choose containment rather than creating vessels incapable of choice, if he had approached the problem from a different philosophical angle, perhaps everything could have been different. But we cannot know, can only see what happened, can only explore the ruins of his choices and decide for ourselves whether his legacy deserves condemnation, pity, respect, or some combination of all three. The Pale King died trying to save his kingdom through means that required becoming a monster, sacrificing his own children in pursuit of the greater good, making choices that isolated him from even those closest to him, and in the end, he saved nothing, changed everything, and left behind a kingdom dying from the very plague he sacrificed so much to prevent. His story ends alone on a throne, in a hidden palace, crown still worn, kingdom still dying, plan still failing, but it doesn't end completely, because the night carries forward the possibility of correction, the chance to finish what was started, to save Hallownest through the very imperfection the king rejected. Whether this redeems his choices or simply completes his tragedy depends on perspective, on whether we believe good intentions and near success balance against catastrophic failure and unconscionable methods, and the game wisely leaves this judgment to players, presenting evidence but refusing to dictate conclusions. In the end, the Pale King remains one of gaming's most complex and tragic figures, a character whose depths reward examination, whose choices provoke thought, whose legacy encompasses both breathtaking achievement and devastating failure, and whose story asks questions about power, sacrifice, consciousness, and cost that resonate far beyond the boundaries of Hallownest's fallen kingdom. His pale light brought sapience to an entire civilization. His terrible choices attempted to preserve that gift. His brilliant planning came within a hair's breadth of success. His fundamental flaw was believing perfection was achievable through sufficient sacrifice, and his ultimate failure was both inevitable, given his flawed premise, and heartbreaking, given how close he came to being right. The worm who became a king, who elevated bugs from instinct to consciousness, who built a kingdom of impossible beauty, who cast his children into darkness in desperate hope of salvation, who died alone with his plan failing around him, represents the heights of achievement and depths of moral compromise possible when power and intelligence operate without sufficient restraint or wisdom. The ruins of Hallownest stand as his monument and his grave, evidence of what was possible and what was lost, and as we explore these depths, encounter his statues and machinery, discover his workshop and throne, we're left to contemplate whether the gift of consciousness, however brief, was worth the price paid, whether his methods could ever justify his goals, whether we should remember him as saviour, monster, or the tragic combination of both that he truly was. Now you've heard the complete tale of the Pale King, from worm to monarch, from kingdom builder to failed saviour, from brilliant god to corpse on a throne, and you understand why his story resonates so powerfully, why Hollow Knight's lore captivates players years after release, why this tale of bugs and gods and infection and void carries weight beyond its setting. The Pale King's legacy lives on in every choice we make as the knight, in every decision about how to engage with the infection, in the multiple endings that offer different resolutions to the problems he couldn't solve, and in the fundamental question of whether consciousness itself, with all its beauty and suffering, is worth the costs required to achieve and maintain it. So as you drift off to sleep, contemplate this god who tried to save his kingdom and doomed it instead, who made terrible choices in pursuit of noble goals, who came so close to achieving the impossible before being undone by the smallest flaw. And remember that the greatest tragedies are not about monsters doing evil, but about beings trying desperately to do good and failing despite or because of their brilliance, leaving behind ruins that testify to both their achievements and their hubris, forever asking questions that have no simple answers, but reward endless contemplation in the pale light of Hallownest's fading dream. Beyond what we know from exploring Hallownest's ruins, there are layers to the Pale King's story that remain partially hidden, fragments of lore scattered throughout the kingdom that suggest his influence extended further and deeper than even the most thorough exploration reveals. Because the king was not simply a ruler, but a researcher whose understanding of fundamental forces shaped reality in ways that persist long after his death. The concept of soul itself, that energy that powers spells and abilities throughout Hallownest, seems to have been something the Pale King studied extensively, and the soul sanctum in the City of Tears, where the Soul Master conducted his twisted experiments, was likely established with the king's knowledge or blessing, suggesting he saw potential in understanding and harnessing this life force. Soul represented another fundamental force alongside void and dream, a third pillar of existence that the king sought to comprehend and potentially weaponize against the infection. And while his own experiments apparently didn't lead to using soul as a solution, the Soul Master's later work shows someone attempting to follow the king's intellectual path, trying to find in soul what the king sought in void. The relationship between these three forces, void and dream and soul, forms a kind of metaphysical triangle that defines existence in Hallownest's reality, with void representing emptiness and negation, dream representing unity and consciousness imposed from above, and soul representing individual life force and power. The Pale King's genius was recognizing how these forces interacted, understanding that void could counter dream, that his pale light could free minds from the radiance his dreaming control, that vessels formed from void could potentially contain a dream god. And this level of metaphysical understanding suggests the king's knowledge extended into territories most bugs couldn't begin to comprehend. His transformation from worm to king itself represents a mastery over his own existence that few beings ever achieve, because he didn't simply change form, but fundamentally rewrote what he was, maintaining power and consciousness while completely altering his physical nature. And this suggests the king understood something about the relationship between consciousness and form that allowed him to reshape himself at will. The White Palace's architecture provides additional evidence of the king's reality-bending capabilities, because the structure doesn't simply defy conventional physics, but seems to exist partially outside normal space, with rooms that fold into themselves, corridors that shouldn't connect but do, and the entire palace's ability to withdraw into the dream realm suggests it was never entirely present in physical reality to begin with. Building a palace that exists simultaneously in multiple states of reality, that can phase between dream and waking world, that contains spaces larger than its exterior would suggest, demonstrates an understanding of spatial manipulation that borders on the divine, and the king accomplished this while also running a kingdom and conducting experiments and raising the Hollow Knight and managing all the other demands of rulership. The path of pain, that brutal gauntlet hidden within the palace, serves as more than just a challenge for players, but as insight into the king's philosophy of achievement, because every saw blade and spike represents his belief that worth must be proven through suffering, that only by enduring the seemingly impossible can true value be demonstrated. This philosophy explains why he cast vessels into the abyss and made them climb, why he tested each one that succeeded in reaching him, why he believed perfect hollowness could be achieved through perfect trial, and it's a philosophy that is both understandable given his circumstances and deeply troubling in its implications. If worth must be proven through suffering, then the countless vessels that died in the abyss failed not because they were created inadequately, but because they weren't strong enough to prove their value. And this shifts responsibility from creator to creation in ways that might have allowed the king to justify his actions to himself. The memory at the end of the path of pain, showing the Hollow Knight standing beside the seated king, represents a moment of connection that the king should never have allowed. Because even that small acknowledgement, that brief recognition of the vessel as something worthy of standing in his presence, planted the seed of attachment that would eventually doom everything. In that single moment of allowing himself to see the Hollow Knight as something other than a tool, perhaps feeling pride or satisfaction at the vessel's perfection, the king created the flaw that would unravel his entire plan. And the tragedy is amplified because this moment of connection, of treating the Hollow Knight with something approaching paternal acknowledgement, might be the most human thing the king ever did. The king's relationship with the king's mold And Wingsmold constructs demonstrates his continued work with Void even after the Hollow Knight's sealing, creating elegant servants that combined Void's emptiness with imposed purpose and form. And these constructs serve eternally without question or flaw, because they truly are hollow in ways the Hollow Knight could never be. The fact that he could create perfectly hollow servants, but not a perfectly hollow vessel, suggests the problem wasn't his understanding of Void, but rather the specific requirements of containing the radiance, which demanded something that could act with apparent will while possessing none, that could fight and move and serve while being completely empty. And this paradox might have been unsolvable from the start. Perhaps no being can truly be hollow while also being functional. Perhaps the act of creating something capable of action inherently imbues it with something that approaches will. And if this is true, then the king's plan was doomed not by execution, but by logical impossibility, by pursuing a contradiction that couldn't exist, no matter how perfectly implemented. The ancient basin, where the king conducted his most sensitive work, holds secrets that suggest the Pale King understood the dangers and moral weight of what he was doing, because the area is sealed away, hidden, accessible only through specific routes, as if he wanted to keep the evidence of the abyss and his workshop away from the general population. The citizens of Hallownest likely never knew about the vessels, never understood what was being sacrificed in the ancient basin, never saw the thousands of dead children in the abyss below the workshop. And this secrecy suggests the king knew his actions couldn't withstand public scrutiny, that even his loyal subjects might rebel if they understood what was being done in their name. This makes his choices more calculated and perhaps more damning, because he wasn't acting in ignorant desperation, but rather making conscious decisions to hide his methods while pursuing his goals, understanding the moral implications well enough to know they needed to be concealed. The White Lady's withdrawal to the Queen's gardens and her binding herself in roots represents not just grief, but complicity, because she participated in the creation of the vessels, laid the eggs that became those thousands of discarded children, and her self-imposed imprisonment suggests she judged herself worthy of punishment even if no one else could hold her accountable. Her dialogue reveals that she understands what they did, acknowledges the king's blindness to imperfection, recognizes her own role in the tragedy, and her continued existence bound and isolated represents a form of penance that will last until Hallownest itself completely falls. The king had no such moment of acknowledged guilt before his death, no evidence that he questioned his choices or sought redemption, and this suggests either that he died still believing he was right, that the costs were justified, that any alternative would have been worse, or that he compartmentalized his guilt so completely that it never manifested in ways we can detect. The collector's purpose and origin remain mysterious, but this void being that imprisons grubs throughout Hallownest seems to have operated under some directive related to preservation, capturing and containing these creatures for reasons that might have made sense to the king's plans, but remain obscure to players. The Collector's Tower in the City of Tears, filled with imprisoned grubs and accessed through specific means, represents another aspect of the king's work with void creatures, another experiment or project whose full purpose died with its creator, leaving only the execution without explanation. Grubs themselves, those small bugs trapped in jars throughout the kingdom, might have been part of some research or preservation effort, or they might simply have been incidental victims of a void construct, following instructions it no longer understands, and the ambiguity reflects how much of the king's work remains unexplained and perhaps unexplainable. The grub father's reward for returning his children, his eventual transformation into something that suggests a darker fate, adds layers of complexity to Hallownest's ecology and the consequences of interfering with natural cycles. Though whether this connects to the king's influence or represents independent mechanics of their world remains unclear. Throughout the kingdom we find arcane eggs, those mysterious objects worth enormous amounts of geo, each one suggesting experiments or creations of tremendous value, an unknown purpose, possibly attempts to create alternative solutions to the infection, or perhaps unrelated projects pursued by a mind that never stopped seeking knowledge. The king's workshop contains machinery whose functions we can only guess at, devices that manipulate soul and void, contraptions that serve purposes we cannot fully understand, and every piece represents avenues of research that might have led somewhere if given more time. The seal binding the abyss itself, keeping the void contained within specific boundaries, demonstrates another application of the king's power, because void left uncontained would presumably spread and consume everything, and maintaining that seal even after death shows how thoroughly the king's work was integrated into Hallownest's fundamental structure. The lighthouses throughout the kingdom, the mechanisms that control the City of Tears' eternal reign, the trams that connect different regions, the elevators and platforms, and all the infrastructure of Hallownest. Much of this likely dates to the king's reign and represents his vision of a connected, functional kingdom where bugs could travel and trade and communicate, the hot springs scattered through various regions, places where bugs could rest and recover, suggest attention to citizen welfare beyond mere survival, a desire to create not just a functional kingdom, but a comfortable one where quality of life mattered. The pleasure house in the City of Tears, the various shops and services, the existence of currency and economy, all point to a sophisticated society that the king either created or allowed to flourish under his rule, and this civilization persisted long enough to become established culture before the infection's return destroyed it. The distinction between the king as creator of consciousness and the king as facilitator of civilization is important, because while he granted sapience, the bugs themselves built much of their culture, created their own art and music and society, and the king's role was providing the foundation while his subjects built the structure. This makes Hallownest a collaborative achievement rather than solely the king's creation, which complicates assigning credit or blame, because the civilization's beauty came from its citizens, while its foundation and ultimate failure stemmed from its ruler. The Mantis Lords, who maintained their own society in the fungal wastes, had some arrangement with the Pale King, respecting his kingdom enough to hold back the threats from Deepnest, suggesting the king was capable of diplomatic relationships with powers that maintained independence from his direct rule. This shows political sophistication beyond mere conquest, an ability to recognize when alliance served better than dominion, when respecting autonomy achieved more than imposing control, and the Mantis Lords' continued honor in maintaining their bargain even after the king's death speaks to the respect he earned from them. Deepnest itself, the twisted realm of weavers and spiders, stood at the edge of Hallownest's influence, and Hera the Beast, its queen, agreed to become a dreamer in exchange for a child, the hornet who would become a significant figure in Hallownest's fate. This deal, trading Hera's eternal sleep for her chance at motherhood, with the Pale King apparently fathering the child himself, adds another layer of complexity to the king's relationships and methods, and because he was willing to form these intimate political alliances when they served his purposes. Hornet's existence as the child of the Pale King and Hera represents a bridge between Hallownest and Deepnest, between pale light and weaver's thread, and she survives into the game's present as one of the few beings who remembers the old kingdom and works to influence its fate. Her perspective on the Pale King, her knowledge of his plans, her role as protector of Hallownest's ruins, makes her a unique witness to his legacy, and her continued activity in pursuing her own goals shows she inherited strength and determination from both her parents. The fact that the king was capable of producing a viable child with Hera, despite their vastly different natures, suggests his transformation from worm allowed him to interact with other beings in ways that transcended normal biological limitations. that he could form these connections when politically or personally motivated, despite being something fundamentally other than the bugs he ruled. This ability to bridge different forms of life, to create offspring with beings of completely different nature, adds to the sense that the king existed on a level beyond normal categories, capable of actions and relationships that should have been impossible, operating by rules that applied only to higher beings like himself. The vessels themselves represent another category of his offspring, created with the White Lady, transformed by void, shaped into something that was neither fully his children nor fully separate creations, and the king's ability to view these beings as expendable tools while also producing Hornet as a valued child suggests a disturbing flexibility in how he categorized and valued life. Perhaps he saw the vessels as failed experiments rather than children. Perhaps the void transformation rendered them something other than offspring in his mind. Or perhaps his capacity for compartmentalization allowed him to simultaneously love some children while discarding thousands of others. And any of these possibilities reflect troubling aspects of his psychology. The pale ore scattered throughout Hallownest, that rare material that shares the king's name and nature, represents another mystery, because this substance seems to be connected to his power, possibly fragments of his original worm form or crystallized essence of his pale light, and its use in upgrading weapons suggests it carries transformative properties even after the king's death. The king's brand, that mark required to access certain sealed areas, demonstrates his ability to create lasting seals that respond to specific conditions, magical locks that endure beyond his life, and open only when the bearer possesses certain attributes or powers. These seals protecting sensitive areas like the abyss's depths show the king's thoroughness in containing his secrets, ensuring that even after his death, only beings of sufficient capability could access the most dangerous or revealing locations. The fact that the knight, a rejected vessel, can obtain and use the king's brand suggests some irony, or perhaps intentional design, because the king's mark recognizes void even in a vessel he discarded, acknowledges the knight's right to access these sealed places despite or because of its abandonment. The dream realm's interaction with physical reality, the dream nail's ability to access thoughts and memories, the dream warriors scattered throughout Hallownest, all suggest a layer of existence that the king understood and potentially manipulated, because his white palace's withdrawal into dreams showed capability to bridge these realms. Dream bosses like the failed champion or the soul tyrant represent powerful beings whose essence persists in the dream realm after death, suggesting consciousness can endure beyond physical destruction in certain circumstances, and the king's own absence from the dream realm, despite his tremendous power, might be significant. Unlike other major figures who leave dream vestiges or appear in Godhome, the Pale King seems to be truly dead, truly gone, with only his corpse remaining. And this completeness of death might reflect something about how he died or what he was, a higher being whose end was absolute rather than transitional. The Void Heart Charm, obtained by uniting the Void under the Knight's will, represents a form of mastery over Void that the Pale King apparently never achieved. Because while he could shape Void and create vessels, the Knight's ability to become Void, to claim lordship over the Abyss, goes beyond anything the King demonstrated. This suggests the King's approach to Void was external, manipulative, using it as a tool rather than understanding it from within, while the Knight's nature, as both vessel and individual, allows a more fundamental connection. The shade, that dark reflection that appears when the Knight dies, represents the Void's presence within the vessel, and the fact that the Knight can reclaim and reintegrate their shade shows a relationship with Void that is cooperative rather than purely dominant. The King viewed Void as something to be contained and directed, a force to be harnessed in service of his goals, but perhaps this instrumental relationship prevented him from achieving the deeper unity with void that allows the night to succeed where the hollow night failed. The siblings in the abyss, those countless vessels that died during the climb, their shades floating in the darkness below the workshop, represent the king's greatest crime made manifest, and the night's ability to unite with these shades, to be acknowledged and empowered by the very beings the king discarded, creates a kind of justice where the rejected become the saviours. When the night descends into the abyss and walks through the void, when the siblings reach out and grant their strength, when the void recognises one of its own who survived and returned, this moment represents everything the king failed to achieve or understand about void's true nature. The king sought perfect emptiness, absolute hollowness, a vessel without connection or attachment. But the night's power comes from connection, from unity with the siblings, from accepting rather than denying the bonds that form between beings even when those beings are supposedly hollow. This fundamental difference in approach, the king's pursuit of isolation versus the knight's achievement through unity, suggests the king's philosophical framework was flawed from the beginning, that he sought answers in severance when the solution required connection. The Godmaster content, that additional realm accessed through dreams and the God Seekers, presents an alternate perspective on Hallownest's higher beings and powerful entities, including the Pale King, who appears as a warrior to be challenged and defeated. His boss fight in Godhome shows his combat capabilities, his use of soul-based attacks and teleportation and summoned weapons, demonstrating why he was feared as a warrior despite his small size and primarily intellectual reputation. The fact that he can be encountered and fought in Godhome suggests his essence persists in some form within the realm of gods and worship, that his impact was significant enough to earn him permanent recognition among the pantheon of powerful beings. Fighting the Pale King allows players to directly engage with the figure who haunts so much of Hallownest's lore, to test themselves against the being whose decisions shaped everything, and defeating him carries symbolic weight, even though this version is a memory or echo rather than the actual king. The Radiance herself, when finally encountered in dreams, or the absolute radiance in Godhome, represents the enemy the Pale King spent everything trying to defeat, and her power justifies his desperation, even while his methods remain questionable, because she is genuinely capable of destroying all individual consciousness in Hallownest, of reducing every bug to dreaming extensions of her will. Fighting the Radiance reveals the overwhelming power of a dream, God fully awakened and angry, her attacks filling the screen with light, her presence dominating the battlefield, and experiencing this firsthand helps players understand why the king believed such extreme measures were necessary. The Radiance's nature as a moth goddess, as the ancient light that predated the Pale King's influence, reveals layers of history that extend beyond even the worm's transformation, because she represents an order of existence that ruled before sapience, before individual consciousness, when unity and instinct defined all life in the lands that would become Hallownest. Her followers, the moths who built the resting grounds and established their tribe as her primary worshippers, turned away from her when the Pale King's light offered something the Radiance never could, the gift of individual thought, and this betrayal by her most devoted servants drove her fury and her determination to reclaim what was taken. The moths sealed away all memory of the Radiance, erased her from their records and their culture, attempted to forget completely the god they had worshipped for ages beyond counting, and this intentional erasure was perhaps done at the Pale King's direction, or at least with his approval, because a forgotten god has no power, no followers, no ability to influence the waking world. But gods are not so easily destroyed, and the Radiance endured in that forgotten place, dreaming her own dreams of vengeance and return, waiting for the moment when the seals would weaken or the memories would resurface. And when the infection began, it proved that forgetting alone could never truly eliminate a being of her power. The dream realm itself, that space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts take form and memories persist, served as the Radiance's domain and her prison simultaneously, because while the Moth's forgetting locked her away from direct influence, she remained powerful within the space of dreams, capable of reaching out to any mind that touched that realm during sleep. The Pale King's understanding of this threat, his recognition that the infection spread through dreams, led him to seek a vessel without dreams, a being whose mind never touched, that realm where the Radiance could exert influence, and this strategy was sound even if its execution proved impossible. The dreamers themselves, those three who gave their lives to reinforce the seal, existed in a state between waking and sleeping, their consciousness bound to totems, while their minds dreamed eternal dreams, and this liminal state made them perfect anchors for a seal targeting a dream god. Lurien the Watcher, positioned in his spire overlooking the City of Tears, served the Pale King with absolute devotion, his loyalty so complete that he willingly accepted eternal sleep without apparent hesitation or doubt, and his mask remains even in death as a symbol of his unwavering dedication. The fact that Lurien watched over the city, that his role was observer and recorder, suggests the king valued having witnesses to Hallownest's glory, wanted someone to remember and document what was built, and Lurien's archives presumably contained records of the kingdom's history that were lost when he became a dreamer. Monomon the teacher, brilliant researcher who ran the archives and educated Hallownest's citizens, brought intellectual curiosity and scientific rigor to her role as dreamer, and her decision to participate in the sealing came not from blind loyalty, but from calculated assessment that the king's plan represented the best available option. Her archives remain accessible in the Fog Canyon, filled with preserved specimens and research notes, evidence of a sophisticated scientific community that the king either established or encouraged, because a kingdom of conscious bugs would naturally develop curiosity about their world. Monomon's request that her student Quirrell be the one to eventually break her seal shows she understood the sealing might not last forever, that contingencies needed to be in place for the day when the dreamers would need to die, and this forward thinking suggests she harboured doubts about the Hollow Knight's perfection even before the sealing was complete. Hera the Beast, Queen of Deepnest, entered the arrangement for different reasons than loyalty or calculation, because her payment was Hornet, the child she desperately wanted, and her willingness to trade eternal sleep for the chance at motherhood reveals the depth of her desire for legacy and continuation. Deepnest's dark tunnels and twisted inhabitants, the weavers who served Hera and the various horrors that lurk in those depths, represent a kingdom that existed outside the Pale King's direct influence, a place where his light never fully penetrated and different rules applied. The weavers themselves, intelligent beings capable of sophisticated weaving and creation, possessed consciousness before the Pale King's arrival, suggesting that his gift of sapience wasn't universal, that some bugs already possessed minds through other means, or perhaps had always been more than instinct-driven creatures. This complicates the narrative of the king as soul granter of consciousness, reveals that multiple forms of awareness existed simultaneously in the region, that the Pale King's influence was profound but not absolute, and that consciousness itself might have multiple sources or manifestations. The relationship between Deepnest and Hallownest, maintained through Hera's agreement and the Mantis Lord's honour, shows the king was capable of recognising limits to his power, accepting that some territories would remain independent rather than attempting to conquer or convert everything. This pragmatism serves the king well in retrospect, because the diversity of independent powers meant that when Hallownest fell, not everything fell with it, that pockets of resistance and alternative societies survived to potentially rebuild or remember. The Mantis tribe structure, their honour-based culture and warrior traditions, Their ability to maintain order in the fungal wastes demonstrates another form of bug society that developed independent of the Pale King's influence, and their respect for him stemmed not from receiving sapience, but from recognizing a powerful ally worth maintaining diplomatic relations with. Their agreement to hold back deepness horrors, preventing the twisted creatures from invading Hallownest proper, served both kingdoms' interests and shows sophisticated political thinking from all parties involved. The mantis traitors, those who rejected the tribe's honour and embraced the infection willingly, show that not all bugs valued individual consciousness over the unity the radiance offered, that some actively chose to return to the hive mind rather than maintaining their separate identities. This suggests the Pale King's gift wasn't universally appreciated, that some bugs found individual consciousness burdensome rather than liberating, preferred collective existence to isolated awareness, and this perspective complicates any simplistic reading of the king as pure liberator. Perhaps for some bugs, the weight of individual choice and responsibility was too heavy, the loneliness of separate consciousness too painful, and the radiance's offer of unity and shared dreaming represented relief rather than imprisonment. The king would likely have viewed such preferences as corruption or weakness, evidence of the infection's insidious nature, rather than legitimate alternative perspectives, because his entire worldview rested on the assumption that consciousness and individuality were inherently superior to collective instinct. This philosophical rigidity, this inability to consider that his gift might not be universally desired or beneficial, represents another aspect of the king's blindness, another way his certainty prevented him from seeing truths that might have changed his approach. The Grim Troop, those mysterious performers who arrive in Hallownest through ritual and flame, seem to exist outside the normal rules of the kingdom, travelling between realms and operating according to cycles that predate the Pale King's influence. The troop's knowledge of Hallownest, their awareness of its fall and the infection, their own cyclical ritual of death and rebirth, suggests they've witnessed kingdoms rise and fall before, that they understand the temporary nature of civilizations in ways the Pale King apparently refused to accept. Grim himself, the troop's master, speaks with sophistication and knowledge that implies tremendous age and experience, and his interest in the night, his recognition of Void's potential, shows awareness of forces the king sought to harness. The Grim Child, that strange offspring created through the ritual, bonded to the night through flame and transformation, represents another form of continuation and legacy, different from but perhaps parallel to the king's own attempts at creating purposeful life. The choice to either complete the Grim Troop's ritual or banish them through the carefree melody offers players agency in determining what persists and what fades, what traditions continue, and what cycles break. And this mirrors the larger questions about the Pale King's legacy and whether his vision deserves continuation or rejection. Brum's alternative path, his weariness with the eternal cycle and desire to end it, shows even devoted servants eventually question whether continuation justifies existence, whether perpetual repetition has meaning, and these themes resonate with the Pale King's own attempts to create eternal solutions to temporal problems. The Kingdom's Edge, that far territory where Hallownest's influence barely reached, hosts the Colosseum of Fools, a gladiatorial arena where bugs fight for glory and geo, and this brutal entertainment suggests aspects of bug culture that developed independent of, or despite the king's presumably more civilized intentions. The Colosseum's trials, escalating in difficulty until reaching the pure vessel fight, demonstrate that Hallownest's culture included violence and combat as entertainment, that the society the king enabled wasn't purely intellectual or refined, but contained elements of savagery and blood sport. The Lord Fool who runs the Colosseum, wealthy from his arena's success, represents a kind of entrepreneurial spirit that the king's economic systems allowed to flourish, and whether the king approved of such brutal entertainment or merely tolerated it as an outlet for violent impulses remains unclear. The pale ore offered as rewards in the Colosseum's highest trials suggests some connection to the king or his materials, though whether this indicates royal sponsorship or simply access to valuable resources is ambiguous. The Fool's Daughter, the collector of warrior dreams, guards the arena's back door and collects essence from defeated warriors, showing that even in spaces dedicated to physical combat, the dream realm and its mechanics remain present. The various warriors and fighters in the Colosseum, bugs from different species and backgrounds all participating in ritual combat, demonstrate the mixing of cultures and peoples that Hallownest facilitated, creating spaces where different bugs could interact and compete regardless of origin. The Nail Masters, those legendary warriors who perfected nail combat into an art form, served Hallownest in their own way, training students and developing techniques that elevated fighting from mere survival to elegant discipline. Their teacher, the great Nail Sage, achieved such mastery that disciples still train in his techniques generations later, and this transmission of knowledge represents another form of culture and civilization that consciousness enabled. The Nailmaster arts, those special techniques like the dash slash and great slash, represent the pinnacle of combat achievement in Hallownest. And the fact that the knight can learn these techniques shows how knowledge persists even after kingdoms fall, how skills and culture can outlive the civilizations that created them. Shio, Oro, and Mato, the three surviving nail masters, each took different paths after their master's death, with Shio retiring to pursue painting, Oro continuing to train students with harsh discipline, and Mato maintaining his techniques in lonely isolation. And these different approaches to legacy and continuation reflect broader questions about how to preserve what matters when everything else crumbles. Shio's transformation from warrior to artist, his discovery that beauty could be created rather than merely protected through combat, represents a kind of enlightenment that the Pale King's gift of consciousness made possible, because only thinking beings can make the choice to put down weapons and pick up brushes. The paintings in Shio's home, his evident satisfaction with his new life, his gentle demeanour so different from his warrior past, all suggest that the sapience the king granted allowed for growth and change and self-reinvention beyond what instinct-driven existence could ever achieve. This multiplicative potential, this ability for bugs to not just exist, but to transform and grow and discover new purposes throughout their lives, might be the Pale King's most profound gift, more important than any specific achievement or structure. Yet this same capacity for growth and change made bugs vulnerable to the infection's corruption, because minds capable of transformation could be transformed in unwanted directions. Consciousness that could choose art could also choose violence or submission to the Radiance's dream. The tragic irony is that the very flexibility and potential that made consciousness valuable also made it fragile, vulnerable to corruption in ways that simple instinct never was, and the Pale King's gift thus contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The infection's ability to spread through consciousness, to use the connections between thinking minds as vectors for transmission, meant that the more sophisticated and interconnected Hallownest became, the more vulnerable it was to catastrophic collapse once the infection began. A civilization of isolated, simple bugs might have contained the infection through natural barriers, but Hallownest's networks of trade and travel and social connection became highways for the infection's spread, turning the kingdom's strengths into weaknesses. The City of Tears, that magnificent metropolis with its Gothic architecture and eternal reign, represents the height of Hallownest's achievement, a place where bugs of all kinds lived together in relative harmony, creating art and conducting business and raising families in safety. The city's fountain, depicting the Hollow Knight in heroic pose, stood as a monument to the king's plan, a constant reminder to citizens that their salvation had been achieved, that the infection was sealed away forever by a perfect vessel. The rain that falls eternally in the City of Tears, never stopping, always present, creates an atmosphere of melancholy beauty, and whether this rain was natural or somehow connected to the king's magic or the city's own nature remains one of Hallownest's smaller mysteries. The various districts of the city, from the wealthy areas near Lurien Spire to the lower levels, where simpler bugs made their homes, show economic stratification and social hierarchy, suggesting that the king's gift of consciousness didn't eliminate inequality or create perfect social harmony. The shops and businesses that line the city streets, the pleasure house, and its mysterious services, the various NPCs who made their homes in these spaces, all represent the organic society that grew from the foundation of consciousness the king provided. Lem, the relic seeker who values Hallownest's artifacts, shows how even in decline, some bugs work to preserve and understand history, to collect and catalogue what remains of a fallen civilization. His shop in the city, his gruff dedication to his work, his knowledge of Hallownest's past make him a valuable source of information and a reminder that scholarship and curiosity persist even when kingdoms fall. The rancid eggs he accepts in trade, those mysterious items that Jin describes as smelling terrible but possessing strange properties, represent another unexplained aspect of Hallownest's ecosystem, items whose origins and true purpose remain ambiguous. Throughout the city we find signs of hasty abandonment, belongings left behind as citizens fled or succumbed to infection, evidence of how quickly Hallownest fell once the seal began failing. The infected bugs wandering the city streets, attacking anything that moves, show the transformation from citizen to hostile husk, the complete erasure of personality and purpose that the infection inflicts. Some bugs survived by hiding, like Cloth in the fungal wastes before she emerges to become a warrior, or like Tiso, who sought glory in the Colosseum before meeting his fate against the infection spread. The various hidden rooms and secret areas throughout the City of Tears, the connections to other regions, the shortcuts and passages that reveal themselves to careful exploration, all demonstrate the complexity of Hallownest's construction, the layers of intentional design and organic growth that accumulated over time. The Soul Sanctum's location above the city, accessible through parkour and careful navigation, placed the Soul Master's twisted experiments literally above the citizens he was supposedly serving, and this elevation mirrors his own sense of superiority and divine right to pursue knowledge regardless of cost. His followers, those soul warriors and soul twisters who helped conduct experiments, show how the Soul Master's corruption spread to others, how his pursuit of power through soul created a small cult of researchers willing to participate in atrocities. The victims preserved in the sanctum, those bugs drained of soul and left as husks, represent another form of horror, distinct from but parallel to the infection's corruption. Because these bugs were killed not by returning to hive mind existence, but by having their individual life force extracted for experimentation. The Soul Master's justification for his experiments, his belief that harnessing soul could provide immortality or power sufficient to combat the infection, reveals how the Pale King's example influenced others in Hallownest, because the king's willingness to pursue extreme solutions created a culture where ends justified means, where sufficient emergency could excuse any methodology. This cultural legacy, this normalization of sacrificing the few for the many, of pursuing knowledge without ethical constraints, of viewing bugs as resources to be expended rather than lives to be valued, might be one of the Pale King's most insidious influences, because it outlived him and corrupted others who lacked his intelligence or his original noble intentions. The Soul Master became a twisted reflection of the king's own approach, conducting experiments on unwilling subjects, pursuing power through research regardless of moral cost, believing his intellect elevated him above normal ethical considerations. And the fact that he operated openly in the City of Tears suggests either the king permitted such research or was too distracted by his own work to notice or care what his subjects did in his name. The Dream Nail's ability to read the Soul Master's thoughts, to understand his justifications and his madness, reveals a being who genuinely believed he was saving Hallownest, who saw his victims as necessary sacrifices, who convinced himself that his work would ultimately vindicate the suffering he caused. And these rationalizations echo the king's own justifications for the vessels cast into the abyss. Both believed themselves uniquely capable of seeing difficult truths, of making choices others couldn't comprehend, of bearing burdens that would crush lesser minds, and both used their intellectual superiority as license to commit acts they surely knew were monstrous by any conventional moral standard. The difference is that the Pale King actually possessed the power and knowledge to potentially succeed, while the Soul Master was ultimately just a talented researcher who overestimated his own capabilities and descended into obsession and failure. The Dream Warrior version of the Soul Master, the Soul Tyrant encountered in the Dream Realm, represents his essence persisting after death, his consciousness so strong or so corrupted that it maintained cohesion even beyond physical destruction, and defeating this dream version offers additional lore and understanding of his character. The fact that beings can persist as dream warriors, that consciousness can maintain itself in the dream realm after the body dies, suggests possibilities for immortality or continuation that the Pale King might have understood but chose not to pursue, perhaps recognizing that such existence was more curse than blessing. The various dream warriors scattered throughout Hallownest, from Gorb to Garlean to Markoth to Zero, each represent bugs whose wills or purposes were so strong that they couldn't fully fade even in death, and their continued existence in dreams offers insight into how consciousness and identity work in this world. Gorb's claims of ascension, his belief in his own elevation to higher states, his cryptic proclamations about minds and transcendence suggest that some bugs pursued their own forms of enlightenment or transformation independent of the king's influence. Garlean's dedication to protecting the resting grounds, his continued fulfillment of duty even in death, shows the power of purpose and commitment to maintain identity across the boundary between life and whatever comes after. Markoth's bitterness and combat prowess, his aggressive defense of his territory, in death as in life, demonstrates how personality traits persist in dream form, how the core of who a bug was survives transformation into dream warrior. Zero's rage against the kingdom, his complaints about betrayal and injustice, suggest that not all servants of Hallownest died content, that grievances and resentments could fuel persistence just as effectively as duty or purpose, and his presence hints at darker aspects of the king's rule that aren't fully explored elsewhere. These dream warriors, collectively, show that Hallownest's history contained more complexity than the grand narrative of king and kingdom suggests, that individual bugs had their own stories and purposes and conflicts that existed alongside and sometimes in opposition to the king's plans. The resting grounds itself, that peaceful area dedicated to death and remembrance, shows a sophistication in how Hallownest's society approached mortality, creating specific spaces for burial and memorial, honouring the dead with graveyards and monuments. The Dreamer's Memorial in the resting grounds, acknowledging their sacrifice for the kingdom, stands as one of the few public recognitions of what was done to seal the infection, though even this memorial doesn't explain the full truth of the Hollow Night, or the vessels, or the abyss. The glade of hope within the resting grounds, that beautiful space where the seer makes her home, serves as a place of unusual peace and natural beauty, suggesting that even in a kingdom built on pale light and stone architecture, spaces for nature and tranquility were valued. The seer herself, ancient moth who predates the Pale King's rise, remembers when her tribe worshipped the radiance, and her presence represents a direct connection to the history the king tried to erase. The worship and devotion that existed before his light offered an alternative. Her dialogue reveals crucial lore about the radiance and the moth's betrayal, about how the infection began and why it targets Hallownest specifically, and her willingness to help the knight despite understanding the implications shows a kind of resigned acceptance that the old world is gone and new solutions must be found. The dream nail she guards and eventually gives to the knight, that tool capable of accessing thoughts and memories and dreams, represents moth magic or technology that exists independent of the king's power, showing again that multiple forms of supernatural ability coexisted in Hallownest's reality. The essence collected through the dream nail, drawn from defeated dream warriors and certain enemies, serves as both resource and metaphysical substance, quantified power extracted from conscious beings, and the mechanics of essence collection raise questions about what exactly is being taken and what it means to accumulate this measure of consciousness or dream stuff. The seer's requests for essence, her ritual upon receiving sufficient amounts, her eventual transformation and departure when the knight completes her requests, all suggest purposes and destinations beyond Hallownest, places where dream and reality interface differently. The moth tribe's history, their temples and structures, scattered throughout Hallownest but especially prominent in the resting grounds, shows they were once numerous and powerful, that their worship of the radiance sustained a significant civilization before the Pale King's arrival. Their choice to seal away knowledge of the radiance, to actively forget their god, rather than split between two lights, suggests either the Pale King's gift was so compelling that total conversion made sense, or his influence was so powerful that resistance seemed futile, or perhaps some combination of both persuasion and pressure. The sealed doors and forgotten shrines, the places where moth worship once flourished now empty or repurposed, stand as monuments to how completely the king's influence displaced the old order, how thoroughly one form of consciousness replaced another. The tragedy from the Radiance's perspective is that she offered something genuine to her followers, a form of existence that worked for countless ages, a unity and purpose that sustained the moths and other bugs in stable civilization, and her followers abandoned her not because she failed them, but because something new and different seemed more attractive. This doesn't excuse her vengeful response or the infection's horror, but it provides context for understanding that the conflict between Radiance and Pale King wasn't simple good versus evil, but rather competing visions of how conscious beings should exist, what relationship minds should have to each other and to higher powers. The Pale King offered individual consciousness with all its potential and vulnerability, while the Radiance offered collective consciousness with its unity and limitation, and both choices have merits and costs that can't be objectively ranked. The king's victory in this conflict was temporary and Pyrrhic, because while he succeeded in freeing bugs from the Radiance's dream, he couldn't protect them from her vengeance, and the civilization he built ultimately fell to the very god he thought he'd defeated through forgetting. The cycle of higher beings competing for influence over lesser bugs, of gods and worms and ancient powers, each offering their own vision of existence, suggests this pattern repeats throughout history, that Hallownest was just one iteration of conflicts that played out before and will play again. The God-Seeker encountered in Junk Pit and central to the Godmaster content seeks powerful beings to worship and attune to, and her presence suggests religions and worship dynamics that exist independent of specific gods, that bugs naturally seek higher powers to revere regardless of which higher power currently holds dominance. Her ability to create the realm of Godhome, to manifest a space where gods and memories of gods can be encountered and challenged, demonstrates powers that seem beyond normal bugs. suggesting she herself might be something more or have access to forces others don't understand. The God-seekers' culture, their systematic seeking and cataloguing of gods, their rituals of attunement, their entire civilization devoted to worship of power, represents another alternative to both the Radiance's unity and the Pale King's individualism, a third path that acknowledges higher beings but maintains agency in choosing which to revere. The pantheons within Godhome, those escalating challenges that culminate in facing the most powerful beings in Hallownest's history, serve as both gameplay challenge and philosophical statement about power and achievement, about what it means to surpass even gods through determination and skill. Fighting through the pantheon of the knight, of the master, of the sage, and finally the pantheon of Hallownest itself, forces players to engage with every major threat and challenge the kingdom contained, to master combat against beings of tremendous power. The Pale King's inclusion in these pantheons, his place among the powerful entities worth fighting, shows he earned recognition as a legitimate threat despite his failure, that his power was genuine even if his plans were flawed. The pure vessel fight, that perfected version of the Hollow Knight, uninfected and at full strength, demonstrates what the king's plan might have achieved if the vessel had truly been hollow, because this version fights with incredible skill and power, showing the potential that was undermined by the flaw of an idea instilled. Seeing the pure vessel's abilities makes the Hollow Knight's failure more tragic, because we understand exactly how close the king came to success, how a being just slightly more perfect might have changed everything. The absolute Radiance fight at the peak of the pantheon of Hallownest represents the Radiance at her most powerful, fully manifested, and completely uncontained. And her overwhelming presence shows why sealing her seemed like the only option, because directly defeating such a being would be beyond most entities' capabilities. The fact that the knight can triumph even against the absolute Radiance, through player skill and determination, shows that what the Pale King attempted, through complex planning and terrible sacrifice, others might achieve through different means, through strength and will rather than hollow vessels. The various endings available in Hollow Knight offer different resolutions to the king's failed plan, different ways of addressing the infection and the Radiance's return, and each reflects different philosophical approaches to the core problem. The basic ending, where the knight takes the Hollow Knight's place and accepts sealing within the Black Egg, essentially repeats the king's solution with a different vessel, hoping that where one failed another might succeed. This ending suggests the king's plan wasn't entirely wrong, just inadequately executed, and that a better vessel might accomplish what the flawed Hollow Knight couldn't. The dream. No more ending, where the knight uses the dream nail to enter the Hollow Knight and directly confront the Radiance, killing her within the dream realm, represents a more aggressive solution, addressing the root cause rather than merely containing symptoms. This ending suggests the king's defensive strategy was unnecessary. That offensive action against the Radiance herself was always an option if anyone possessed sufficient strength and determination to pursue it.